So, we are ready to start with the first panel. And as Maria already introduced, this panel is titled Between Scylla and Charybdis, indicating the interest in Greek mythology, I guess. But I think everybody knows the story about Odysseus trying to find his way and then finding himself between two sea monsters, not being able to make one good choice, but has to navigate between two bad ones. And this, I think, is a good metaphor for humanitarian daily life in certain settings as well. I'm happy to introduce our panelists on this panel. First of all, Juliet Parker, the director of ALNAP. ALNAP was founded in 1997.
Thanks.
The full name is the Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance, but you have gone for a shorter version throughout. It's a global network focused on improving humanitarian response and brings together a wide array of stakeholders in the humanitarian sector, including NGOs, UN, academia, and donors. And it also is known for producing influential report on the state of the humanitarian system. And many of you can remember her from last year as the last year's keynote speaker at this conference as well. Welcome.
Thank you.
Secondly, William Anderson is the director of SWARE, and everybody knows the SWARE standards in the sector. So the SWARE is the humanitarian organization that establishes and promotes standards of high-quality, accountable humanitarian response, and also founded in 1997. So it was really the mid-90s was a high point of standardization and quality thinking. Welcome as well.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Miro Modrusan is the representative and policy advisor for our good partner organization INTERSOS, a humanitarian organization that provides assistance to people affected by conflict, extreme poverty, and natural disasters, established in 1992, so a bit earlier, in Italy, and operates in regions worldwide, particularly in countries facing severe crises, like South Sudan, Yemen, and Afghanistan, and so forth. Before handing, and welcome Miro as well. Before handing the floor to our three panelists, let's set the scene and focus of this panel. So humanitarian ethics is a very wide domain to delve into, and we could easily end up discussing for days on the different takes. But what we would like to delve into today is the conflict between the principles and the practice of humanitarian action, and how to resolve the conundrums that we face along the way. So between the Scylla and Charybdis. Kind reminder that humanitarian work is centered around 4 core principles, which are widely acknowledged. 2 of them are moral principles, that of humanity and impartiality. These emphasize why we do the work we do. While the other 2 principles are operational in nature, the neutrality and independence. And neutrality, in essence, means that we work in such a way that we don't support either side of the conflict. And independence, on the other hand, foresees that the humanitarian action must be autonomous from any other political, economic, military, and other objectives. And so we, as a sector, have set forth very high standards and high thresholds for us to pass every single day. So we are required to be impartial, independent, professionally competent. We are required to be focusing on preventing and alleviating suffering alone. And we must do all of that even in situations where others do not share these principles and standards. We are routinely presented with practical and moral questions about what to do. For example, when does working closely with a warring party in order to gain access to affected people, when does it turn to complicity in human rights violations? Or how can we really be impartial when our activities and movement are restricted by the government or armed groups? Or even more operationally, how can we overcome the inherent tension between professionalization and localization, as Christina mentioned as well? So let's dig in the conversation. I would start with you, Miro. You are coming from operational organization on the ground, which faces these dilemmas, conundrums every day. So how do you see the principles of neutrality especially, but also independence, and the dilemmas that are posed by these situations, as I described, being played out in the field every day?
Thank you very much, Eero. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to your conference. I'm really delighted to be here. Yes, we've already heard some interesting thoughts at the beginning of the conference by Christina, you, and maybe just before talking about humanitarian principles, just to refer back to some of the comments you said about the basically erosion of IHL and a lot of impunity that we see today. I think this also has a major impact on humanitarian action on the ground, because apart from we as humanitarian organizations are often also perceived as sort of Western supported donors, and when you see this kind of impunity where member states who are also your donors are not calling out these IHLs, that can have an impact on the perception that you have on the ground in other contexts and in all contexts where you work. And I think this is really an important thing. So when we talk about principles, and again, I will just briefly repeat what you said. Of course, humanity and impartiality are like the most, let's say, core principles of humanitarian action, because of the compassion and the need to help the fellow human being who's suffering, and to do that in an impartial way based on needs that you identify. But in order to do so, you need to also abide by other principles, which we call more kind of operational posture, which is about how do you actually negotiate access to the humans that are suffering. So humanitarian access is not really an end goal by itself, but it's a way for us to create a space so that we can actually deliver this impartial assistance to all those that need it. Now, obtaining this access is extremely challenging. I was in a meeting, I think, by ICSC some months ago, where one of their experts have said that there's they identify at least about 500 different non-state armed groups around the world. And all these, of course, are in conflict zones, and there's an estimated 175 million people living in these areas controlled by non-state armed groups. So if you're a humanitarian organization, of course, you need to go and talk to everyone. You need to talk to those armed groups, you need to talk to the government armed groups, and so on, in order to be able to explain who you are, why you're there, that you have on the humanitarian agenda, that you have to provide assistance to all those that need it, regardless of which side of the conflict they are. And so this is extremely complicated. And for that, you need to really maintain a very clear perception by all those parties that you really don't have any political agenda. You don't want to take sides in the conflict. You're a humanitarian, your job stops there. You're there to identify those that need assistance, and you're gonna, this is your prerogative. You need to provide that assistance. Just also, because Christina, you mentioned, for example, Ukraine. And I think it's also, what I'm talking about, I want to make a clear distinction. I fully appreciate that if you are a person who is, who lives in a country that's under the conflict, it is difficult to maintain neutrality. That's completely clear. I mean, I'm Croatian. For some of you who are old enough might remember that during the breakup of Yugoslavia, there was a war. And of course, as a Croatian, I could not have been neutral in what was going on. But as an international, as somebody who works for an international organization working under conflicts, I have to abide by that principle of neutrality and make sure that I don't take sides. Otherwise, probably I will not be able to obtain access. So I just really wanted to highlight the importance of neutrality purely as a very practical principle that enables you to reach people that really need assistance. Perhaps I stop here for the moment.
Thank you, Miro, and we will dig into the problematic there on the very operational level shortly as well. But William, coming from an agency which is synonymous with standardization and humanitarian quality, how do you see the sector faring when it comes to the principles as well as the standards?
Thank you very much, Eero. Yeah, and to answer that question, I'd like to dig into a little bit about what I believe the humanitarian sector to be in. So I think we're in a state of midlife crisis rather than full existential crisis. So we're having doubts about who we are, about where we've come from, and about where we're going. What is our sense of purpose? So I think we're in the middle of this midlife crisis. Now, I also want to acknowledge just how difficult humanitarian assistance is. It's very easy to criticize it, but actually there is a lot of great work going on as we speak around the world. A lot of people are being supported. It's really, really tough work, and it's very easy to criticize. And what humanitarians do is that they come alongside people at the worst time of their life, when people are in trauma, when they're in grief, when they're in loss. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that from the start, that it's easy to criticize, but just how difficult humanitarian assistance is. We're working in chaos, in disorder. And as the Director General mentioned earlier, humanitarians are now a target, seen as a target and are targeted. Now, I'm working in Geneva at the moment, but I have worked around the world and been far too long in the sector. But I'm struck how much more difficult we make it for ourselves as humanitarians. We use terms, terminologies, acronyms that are confusing. And actually, we make it harder for ourselves to talk about issues because we don't know where that common ground is about exactly what we're talking about. We're also in great competition with each other. UN agencies compete with each other all the time. NGOs compete with UN for funding. NGOs compete with other NGOs for funding. International compete with national. It's a great competitive environment as well. So often we're trying to pull each other down rather than lifting each other up. There's a lot of politics in the sector. I won't go into that, but being in Geneva, I've found that out quite quickly. There's a lot of negativity as well. And we're too quick, I would say, to criticize. Too quick to criticize based on assumptions, based on judgments that are not fully founded in actual fact. And often humanitarians, I see people now who are coming into the sector because it's a career rather than a calling. And that has implications as well as to who we are and what our motivation is. So we're too often failing backwards rather than forwards. The innovation is fantastic, it's happening, and we say that we want to fail forwards, but we're too often failing backwards. And there's this often repeated mantra, the humanitarian sector is not fit for purpose. And we hear it all the time. We hear it at panel events such as this, we read it in reports, we're not fit for purpose. But I want to move beyond that. I want to really dig into who we are and why this midlife crisis can give us hope, as that question had come from. Talking a little bit about the principles, one confusing aspect about the principles is that we don't fully appreciate what they are across the sector, from frontline workers to capital workers to head office workers. We're not on the same playing field. Because for me, there are two absolute values. These are values, they're inherently good in and of themselves. That's humanity, which is all about the rights of an individual and recognizing the inherent worth of each person. And there's impartiality, which is about equitable distribution of aid, finding those most in need of aid without adverse distinction. Now, those are two great absolute values, brilliant. The other two, as Miro was mentioning, I see them as modus operandi. They're means to an end. They're not good in and of themselves. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when talking about neutrality, said if you're quiet in the face of oppression, then you're on the side of the oppressor. So neutrality is not an inherently good thing. And that, I think, is why we've got into this difficulty, because we're not just making it very clear, these are two and these are two. And independence. Again, independence is not a good thing. I read psychology for a while, and I know that if you leave a child, a baby, alone for just a few weeks, without touch and without being dependent on the mother, it will die. And then organizations, none of us are independent on our own. We're all interdependent. So again, it's not a good thing in and of itself, but it's a means to an end. It enables humanitarian action to take place. And we'll dig more into this later. Another way we make it really hard for ourselves is that we use terms such as do no harm. Do no harm is great. It's a protection principle. It enables access again. It enables us to do our work, being accountable to who we serve. But what a high bar that is, do no harm. No one, no organization, no agency can do no harm. There's always a negative impact in our work, be it an environmental one, be it a financial one, an economic one, a social one, etc. So by saying do no harm, Mary Anderson in the early 90s was talking about let's make good decisions where we're deciding what is the least worst option. So it's do the least harm possible. But it's kind of morphed during the years into this do no harm, repeated. But actually it's much more nuanced than that. So again, the language we use, the terms we understand, in a way kind of making it confusing for ourselves. I could go on about protection. Again, protection, it's the states themselves who have responsibilities for citizens. And under IHL, International Humanitarian Law, it's belligerents who have responsibility to make sure that humanitarian assistance gets to the people in need. So protection burden is more on states and more on belligerents than it is on NGOs. And then that gets confusing as well. But protection is absolutely necessary and central to our work. Christina mentioned it earlier as well about nexus. Then we have language about linking relief to rehabilitation to development, what was known as LRRD. And talking of acronyms, there's DMP, there's DRR, there's CCA, climate change adaptation, and so on. There's a lot of different ways we repackage what we're talking about in terms of bringing humanitarian assistance alongside development and having a longer-term goal than simply providing day-to-day support. What are the underlying causes and can we address them? So we keep repackaging what we actually mean. Again, that gets confusing. So at the time of midlife, we're not quite sure what we're really meaning, what we're talking about sometimes. And then when it comes to climate, there was an ODI, a Humanitarian Practice Network document that came out, a paper that came out in February this year. It said humanitarians still haven't agreed on what we're going to do about climate. And yeah, we might get into it later on today, but Hugo Slim's book's just come out on climate change, our work on COP as the sector. Again, if we're not fully agreed that actually we need to both protect and restore nature, restore the environment, if we're not agreed on that, then we're going to make it harder for ourselves. Again, in a way, we're setting ourselves up to fail. Let me just talk a little bit about Sphere. So I'm William, I work with Sphere. We have a handbook. It's a guidance document on minimum standards in humanitarian assistance. Eero very kindly said that everybody knows about it, but actually a lot of people don't know about it anymore. And so that's partly why I'm here, is just to get a little bit more visibility on this. It's standards, but it's minimum standards. And it's very basic as well. If you read one of these standards, or 53 of them, they're all qualitative standards which talk about let's make sure that people have safe, secure access to water for drinking and, for example, domestic use. Now, these standards are qualitative, and underneath them there are contextualized indicators. But the standards are minimum. They're not maximum, they're not medium average standards, they're minimum standards. And they're guidance standards as well. Sphere doesn't follow up, we don't ask for any reports. It's not I see it more as a lighthouse guidance rather than a way of making sure that we criticize others. No, not at all. Sphere is all about building up and supporting. I feel like I'm going on a little bit too much. I'll stop there, Eero, and allow Juliet and others to talk about the Q&A, but looking forward to getting more into what does quality mean and why do we have it?
Thank you, William. And indeed, we will be coming back to these topics as well. And actually, when you said do no harm as about the do no harm as a principle, then I remembered also that there was a different guidebook also published in the late 90s or early 2000s, which was the Good Enough Guide. I think it sends sometimes a better message that there is a certain threshold that we need to get to, like the minimum standards of Sphere, but it's not, it doesn't define the absolute value which we need to reach to and then constantly fail in reaching. But we will come back to it. And Juliet, listening to the other two panelists as well, on the principles and on the use of standards and reaching them, do you think that the decision makers in the humanitarian sphere right now actually have the information they need in order to make these decisions, to make take a principled stance in face of these dilemmas?
Sure. So just a little confession. When William says there's terms that people are confused about, I have to admit that I always feel nervous about the term ethics, because there's so many smart people that think about it a lot and write about it a lot, and it's this concept that has a whole kind of, there's a whole thing over there, and I've never really particularly understood it or quite felt comfortable with it, which is why I agreed to do this panel, was to actually, it's like, okay, it's enough now, Juliet. Now you have to get to grips with it. And now looking into the kind of the concept of ethics and ethics within humanitarian action, it is really complicated. Like there is no simplified explanation of what we're talking about within humanitarian ethics. And so, but coming from ALNAP, which is the learning network, I suppose what occurred to me about ethics is that there's kind of agreed norms and expectations, and then there's personal judgment. There's a huge element of personal judgment. So when I was looking at it from kind of ALNAP's perspective, I felt quite strongly about the ethics of knowing what we're talking about in like when we're making decisions in humanitarian action, but also of acting on what is known. And that seemed to be really, really important. And this question about whether decision makers have the information they need to make the decisions they're making, I think is really, really important. Sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. And sometimes we don't need the information also. So there was kind of different cases. Prioritization is one of the big ethical discussions in the sector at the moment. And we're just, at ALNAP, we're going to put out some podcasts as kind of explainers on what the prioritization discussions are. But what struck me when I was talking to the team is, the idea of a funding gap is about having two measurable points and understanding the gap between them. And it's like Christina was referencing, we have the financial data, and there is there's a massive drop in funding has happened, but is also likely to happen more next year as well, around $8 billion or something dollars. But that has to be put in context of the fact that the overall amount of humanitarian funding has something like tripled in 20 years. So it is dropping, but it's coming off the back of a very significant increase. So that's one thing. The other thing is actually what we know about and the information that we have about humanitarian needs. And when we start looking into it, it's really, really complicated. We don't have, or we haven't historically had, a standardized approach to identifying and understanding what we mean by needs. It's been done on a sector basis, with no standard methodology. And also it has a kind of inherent conflict of interest because it's the organizations that are going out and assessing needs who are the ones who are also then using that information as the basis for funding requests. So there's something that's a bit flawed around that. And there's the GIAF, which is the Joint Needs Assessment Tool that's, I think, now been around for about a year, which is really interesting because what it's looking at is how are there ways to standardize and improve the collection and comparison of needs assessment information in order to be able to make, to understand what are the needs, but also how can we compare the level of needs across different contexts, which is extremely difficult to do. Has been historically. So when we're talking about the funding gap, the financial information is a little bit nuanced than just going down. And also the needs assessment data actually isn't as strong as we want. But even when you have that information, there's also a very ethical conversation. And again, it links to what Christine was saying about anticipatory action also, is there's a really ethical challenge to the sector about do we focus on life-saving assistance? Is that where the humanitarian sector can make the biggest difference? And there's some, I was trying to find it, but I couldn't find it, but it was a stat from a couple of years ago that, the IPC rating, so the famine is 5, and I couldn't source it, I'm sorry, but from my recollection, more people die in IPC 3s than in IPC 5s. So more people die actually before you get to the extreme level. So then that has an implication for where we place humanitarian funding. The other thing on the prioritization debate that is really, really important is, of course, we know that data isn't the sole basis for making funding decisions. Like, levels of need are not the only decision, and funding is political. And again, as Christina pointed out, the concentration of where funding is coming from and who funding is going to means that as that concentration becomes more, more extreme, the money in the system becomes more political because it's being governed by the decisions of a smaller group of people. So, but what we find a lot is that the donors or the people working within the donor agencies are desperate for more information, more data, and more analysis in order to try and leverage their political conversations to protect that space. Anyway, so there's the prioritization one. The other thing is that I think the localization debate, which is another important ethical debate within this sector at the moment, is another interesting one because actually the evidence base for localization isn't that strong. It's primarily an ethically driven initiative or set of conversations because it's about respecting agency, capacity, decision-making power, and where that should sit. And actually, the evidence base for whether or not local actors are better positioned to respond is only in the latter stages of the conversation now beginning to catch up. And that's mainly because, not because the humanitarian actors need convincing, it's because, again, the donors need the evidence in order to leverage the changes within their kind of bureaucratic and accountability mechanisms. The third one that I wanted to pick out was another of the kind of learning sticking points within the humanitarian sector is on accountability to affected populations. And this is kind of the opposite. Is that on that, we have the information. We have spent 10, 15 years as a sector investing in complaints mechanisms, feedback mechanisms, soliciting and understanding the views. You've got great initiatives like the Ground Truth Solutions. The voice of people and the voice preferences and expectations of people is being represented and captured within the system. But then where we're finding the sticking point is the institutions do not have the adaptability and flexibility to be able to change their activities in response to that. So there's another ethical dilemma there about, we're stuck as organizations, we're stuck within the system that we've built. And even now when we get the evidence, data, and information, we don't have the ability within our system to flex and change to respond accordingly. And then just to pick up on, we were talking about this last night, which is why it was in the front of my head also, this issue of principles and making principled decisions in difficult environments. One of the things we were looking at in the State of the Humanitarian System report that came out very strongly for me was that it was hard for us to get realistic representations from organizations about the actual realities of how they were able to, the extent to which they were able to act in principled ways or not, which I thought was really interesting because the organizations are well set to talk very well and very convincingly on their commitment to humanitarian principles. That's given. But actually, it was quite difficult for them to talk in an open, transparent way about actually the extent to which they're able to implement in line with those or not, which I thought was interesting because what we found was that there was a lack of, on the whole, there was a lack of guidance and tools being provided to the decision makers in the country programs in order to, to guide them on how they made their decisions. So the principles were espoused by the organizations, but then the tools to enable the decision makers to make the decisions in line with those principles weren't as they should be to help. So you ended up with individuals having to make, their own relatively unguided decisions, but also organizations not being ready to actually look critically at what decisions were being made in order to accurately reflect and represent the extent to which they were living out their commitments or not, which I thought was really interesting. So what it led me to think was that we do need good data and evidence and information in order to be able to make principled decisions. Not always, but mostly. And that making sure, who was it, Barack Obama said, it's not cool to not know what you're talking about. Like, it isn't cool to not know what you're talking about, and often we don't. And actually, we have to be honest about that and ready to address it. The other is that ethics is about judgment. There is, there's things that are true, and then you have to interpret and apply in your context. So actually, we need to then provide the guidance and tools for organizations and individuals to be able to act on that information. We also need the spaces to be honest, particularly in an increasingly competitive funding environment. The level of honesty and transparency of organizations, or their ability to be, I think, will go down, because I always think, organizations in our system are incentivized to demonstrate why they're good rather than to question if they're good at what they're doing. And with the principles, that becomes more important. But also, we need to be able to collectively challenge and champion the principles. Whatever our ethical, stance is, it has to be collective and it has to be championed, because we have talked all the way through my humanitarian career about the, loss of humanitarian space and the, all the loss of respect for the IHL and everything. But it does feel like this is a particular tipping point. And there's a sense that we need to, again, come together as a collective and be strong and, in solidarity and speaking together on things that are really important. We were looking back in ALNAP at the tsunami response, which is now 20 years ago. Oh, and this is a cool point. It's not by chance that ALNAP and Sphere and others like CHS came up in the 90s. They came up in the 90s in response to the Rwanda genocide evaluation findings, which was a collective learning initiative that shone a light. It was collectively owned by the sector, and it shone a light on the sector, and the sector came together as a collective leadership and said, that isn't good enough. We have to do this, we have to do it now, and we have to do it together. And a little bit, looking back at the tsunami, I've kind of become a little bit fascinated. It's like, where are those moments now? Like, where's the collective learning? Where's the collective reflection? There's a lot of collective commitments, like the Grand Bargain and the, World Humanitarian Summit and everything, but the ability to come together and actually make the changes, actually challenge the limitations of our midlife crisis system, which I think is a great, it's a great phrase, because we're not done on the journey. But we are reaching the point of the next stage of, rethinking our purpose, and do we need to buy a Jaguar, or what's the kind of thing that we need to do to move us on again? And that has to be done collectively, because without that we won't be able to enact the changes that we need.
Can I just briefly? Yes. And just to pick up one point on accountability to affected people, which I think is extremely important. So, I think we've moved away since the early days where we would go as foreigners to a country and just tell people what they need and give them as aid. I don't want to oversimplify, but a little bit it was like that. And so accountability to affected people is a really important commitment by the system to really recognize that you really need to talk to communities to understand their needs and then try to provide them. And so there's a wide acceptance of that, and there is a commitment to that. However, what I'm really struggling with, especially in recent couple of years, is there's so much pressure now from the donors to reduce the funding. There's a lot of pressure on the UN, who is on OCHA, who is coordinating humanitarian response plans, to basically kind of go back to basics and focus on pure, strictly humanitarian needs. Now, if you go and talk to communities, often they really want something else. So I find that we're basically potentially failing those communities by not, on one level we go and talk to them, we hear what their needs are, and then the donors tell you, okay, we have money for that, so forget the needs of the communities. So it's a real struggle. On one level, you really try ethically to respond to the real needs of the population. At the same time, you're constrained by all these pressures and discussions that may not necessarily address that. So just wanted to make that point. Thanks.
And actually, let's delve then, jump a bit into the independence and relatedly funding question, since this is where you dropped off. So we have seen consistently the efforts to politicize aid, to have the political agenda hidden, to use it for political gain and capital. And also stemming from what Christina was saying about the major donors being the key Western countries, which also do it for their own purposes. And even though Estonia, as well as all the major donors, are parts of the good humanitarian donorship, which Kairi mentioned earlier today, then I think it's also a question of perception, because at the end of the day, you will still go in with your US flag taped on the food package, and there's this relation to the donor. How independent do you feel is the sector when it comes to this kind of connection to financing? Any of you?
I'll have a first go,
sure.
But I think you're an expert, but anyway, I'll start. It's a very complex question, obviously, and it's not a new issue. I think the politicization of aid has somehow always been on the table. Perhaps in recent years we see a lot more of that. And a clear example to me is that certain crises receive huge amount of money, literally billions, which is not unjustified, but at the same time, many other crises that may not be high on the political agenda of the donor countries receive very little funding. And therefore, where are we as humanitarians and our impartiality when you you can respond amply to certain crises, whereas in other crises you're struggling to even cover the very basic needs of those populations. So I think, as somebody who works for INTERSOS, a humanitarian organization present in 23 countries, working in protection, health, and some other sectors, I'm not going to pretend that we have a perfect answer for that. We are really struggling ourselves. But at least what we try to do, maybe just to talk on a practical approach, how we try to deal with that, is that we really will accept money only if we think that this is something that in response to a grant that would support an activity that is within what we consider to be a priority and that will actually make a difference in terms of addressing humanitarian needs. And the second way we try to do it is try to really diversify funding for each crisis, so that you are not really being seen as receiving money from perhaps one or two donors that may have a political agenda. It's a bit oversimplifying, but it's a very, very limited kind of space that you have in terms of dealing with this kind of problem, and this is how we try to do it. Again, I'm sure that we have issues and challenges in that, but that's the main kind of approach we would take.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we also have these kind of emerging donors, Saudi Arabia as a donor, for example, for humanitarian assistance, etc., which come in with their own different agendas as well. But Juliet and William.
Yeah, just if we go back to the Red Crescent Code of Conduct, which came out in 1994, incidentally the same year as the Rwandan genocide, which is why Sphere, ALNAP, etc. came into existence, because we did such a bad job then. If we go back to that Red Cross Code of Conduct, it talks about independence as humanitarian assistance not being tied to a particular religious or political standpoint. So already in there, there's an inherent acceptance that many agencies, UN, NGOs, will be taking money from states. So I think that's a really important point about, it's not about accepting the money from a state where you disagree with its foreign policy, but it's about, are you as an agency able to have a proper argument with that state that the money you will accept is for these purposes and not at all tied to these purposes. So that's why I think it's really important for strong, ethically minded people to be in agencies and to have those hard conversations. And then it's a decision. Do you want to, in a sense, maybe be considered to be compromising on independence because you're taking money from a state whose foreign policies you do not believe in? That's the decision that agencies make at head office level about accepting program funding. And then I think with independence as well, it's really important that we don't throw it out, because independence is about working in humanitarian situations where principles are needed. And if you throw out principles because you think it's no longer needed, then you're throwing away the foundation upon which you're based. I was at the ICRC and the Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent General Conference. They have it every 4 or 5 years last week. And the main points that both presidents of ICRC and IFRC were making was, we need to keep our principles. There are 120 conflicts going around the world. If we throw away our principles now, we're not going to be able to operate in many of those conflicts. They're really important to the work that we do.
Yeah, yes, totally agree. And but another point on it also is around this kind of system evolution point, is actually the more concentrated, the more dependent we are on fewer donors, the less able the system is to evolve. Because in order for systems to change over time, you need a broad and diverse range of perspectives, experiences, and decisions within the system. The system won't change based on the existing power holders, because they have no incentive to change or evolve it. So actually, everything that we're saying around kind of quality delivery and the need for the system to evolve and change will also only happen by diversifying the funding base, much as BHA may want to evolve it more than that, but it's impossible. And I think what's interesting is, those examples around, insurance and all those sorts of things, but also the philanthropies are interesting. They bring different accountabilities, but they also bring different learning perspectives into the sector. Different kind of risk thresholds, they have their, different kind of ethical assumptions, and like also with the new and emerging donors too. But they also have different accountabilities, which I think is an interesting ethical decision. Anyway, sorry, I get on to a different thing. But I think the diversifying is important not only because of the politicization of aid, but also because of our ability to move beyond the existing status quo within the system.
But the flip side of that may also be that many donors are then focused on only the new and the most innovative ideas all the time, then neglecting the forgotten crisis, the constant needs which are there, because it's the hype which takes away the funding streams. No?
Agreed.
Yes.
Okay, but let's then shift gears a bit towards the neutrality, because this is what Miro also mentioned. This is one of the fundamental issues we oftentimes need to grapple with. The question of access versus actual or perceived neutrality. As you said, we have to be able to talk to every side, but then this may also be taken against us by the other side, whom we are also talking to. But this is a warring situation, so it's armed conflict, and it's not so easy to maneuver and navigate. So, what is your feeling? How successful are we in navigating these situations? And relatedly, are we, kind of trickling down the decisions in our organizational trees to, junior staff in the fields who are maybe not in the best place to make these decisions, but are then forced to make this decision of, should we pay a bribe? Should we give a list of beneficiaries to the authorities and so on?
The short answer to your question is, again, it is really complex. I don't think we can easily claim that we are navigating neutrality very easily, because there's so many different elements here. There's warring parties, there's communities that are affected, there's social media, all sorts of information flying around. There is, of course, the funding you receive from certain donors that may make a perception of you as somebody who might not be neutral. There's a whole list of problems that you're facing when you have to secure that humanitarian space and prove, if you like, that you have a neutral approach and that you have absolutely no other agenda. So I'm hesitant to say how successful we are, because I don't think it's also easy to measure. I can only say from experience that we are literally in every context that we are really struggling with this, that we are really, that the list of, to-do list of problem solving for the managers that you mentioned in the field is constantly evolving and growing. And the only thing we can do is to just be very persistent and very consistent in our approach by talking to all stakeholders, being completely transparent at any moment and explain who you are, what you do, why you do it. You really, need to invest. And this is something I actually realized recently, that we are not very good at this, is that we need to constantly invest in training people on principles. We need to kind of expose them to discussions on different case studies so that they really understand, to kind of help them get into practical tools how to deal with all these challenges. Because again, every context is different, every situation is different. There's going to be always something that needs to be addressed. And we are trying to address this, but I think we need to put a lot more effort and time and resources into that. You also, you can't also expect from younger professionals coming into this sector to just know all of this by heart. It's also the experience that will help you, eventually deal with problems. So again, that just highlights the need for this. Thank you for investing into these capacities, and really. We need to talk to the communities continuously, explain who we are, again, be transparent. We can't just assume they will see us as humanitarians who are there to help. They're also influenced by their situation, by different warring parties. So it's really just constant transparency. Refrain yourself from making some weird social media post that would somehow implicate you into political problems. It's I'm not sure I'm really answering your question. I'm more kind of able to tell you what I think we need to continue doing in order to overcome this challenge.
Yeah, and actually, carrying out internally these humanitarian principles trainings as well. And as Juliet said, ethics is not one side, there's oftentimes not the one straight answer. Doing these trainings internally, I always see in the room utilitarians and the deontological thinkers, and they, based on this, foundational principles they base their thinking and ethics on, they end up having different choices, whether to prioritize access or to prioritize certain principles. But William.
Yeah, just to build on what Miro was saying, I think humanitarians have a decision to make, and it's a little bit simple, but do we do one of three things? Do we exit a situation, a region, a country? Do we just walk away? Do we stay and engage, and then go into what's known as compromises on the two operational principles? Some compromises on neutrality, some compromises on independence that enable the agency to do their work, fulfill their mission, but not so compromised that they're crossing a red line. And then the third one is we're just going to collaborate. We're just going to do exactly what maybe the non-state armed actor is telling us to do, which is what happened in Goma after the Rwandan genocide, and is happening some places around the world. Do we just simply become like a logistics service deliverer, like an Amazon, just handing out just what we can, when we can, where we can? And it doesn't matter that we have principles, let's forget them. So one of those three choices. Most humanitarian assistance is in that second bracket. It's about engagement and then some compromises that are seen as pragmatic to enable the work to be done. So that's the kind of ethical decisions that's constantly happening. So just to maybe give some context, so North Korea, DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, it's very, very, very hard, actually I'm going to say impossible, to fulfill principled humanitarian assistance. I had the dubious pleasure or privilege of going there and seeing for myself that agencies just gave everything to the government. Any agency there now is giving everything to the government, and then the government gives you back your office, your staff, your vehicles, and where you're going to work, i.e. you're not able to be principled humanitarian actors. But there's a decision that agencies are making to say that some good is being done for some people, but it's at this cost. Now then, for example, in Ethiopia, where we've had the terrible conflict in Tigray, and which has spread around more northern parts of Ethiopia, there are decisions to be made about, can agencies try to work in Tigray and in other regions? In Myanmar, can you work in Rakhine and in other regions? And often that's where agencies are making that ethical decision. They're enabling themselves to stay and work in Tigray, but fulfilling what the government wants them to do and work in another part of Ethiopia, or work in Rakhine and work in another part of Myanmar, because that enables the registration to continue. These are the kind of compromises that agencies are having to make all the time, and it's never a black and white, it's never just a clear cut. It's always blurred, it's always slightly grey, with the two modus operandi, operational independence and neutrality.
Can I, just to complement what William was saying, on example of Afghanistan. So when, almost 3 years ago when Taliban took over ruling the entire country, we've had a long-term engagement in Taliban and working there. And before this happened, we were in fact working in Taliban controlled areas because that's where we thought the humanitarian needs were greatest. But then when this big change happened and then suddenly Taliban imposed all these huge restrictions on women, to work in humanitarians, education and so on, we, along with other humanitarian actors, were really struggling. What do? Do you continue working in Afghanistan because the humanitarian needs are great, and especially when the development assistance stopped overnight, so the needs will skyrocket, or do you leave because how do you work in an environment where there are such blatant human rights denials and abuses? But for us, we've really concluded that as humanitarians, as much as we support, of course, human rights, there's no doubt about that, but we're just gonna have to continue working, because if you leave, those target groups, particularly women, will be possibly even in worse situation without any access to health. For example, we provide some health assistance there, and it's not an easy decision. It's been a real major debates, pro and cons, about that. But then, just lastly, like, we also then spoke to actually Afghan women. It's like, well, what is it, in your opinion, we should do? And they're all like saying, no, you need to stay. You know, if you leave, you're the last of the internationals that will go, and we will have nothing. So that's another kind of example of the kind of dilemma that you have to face. And do you stick to human rights approach, or do you just look at purely humanitarian needs?
And this is exactly the principled pragmatism that William was also conveying. Juliet?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm not sure, it might just be by chance, but I'm seeing more humanitarian diplomacy initiatives coming up this last few years. Maybe they've always been there and I'm just becoming more aware of them, but the idea that, yeah, there needs to be more direct support and training and, space for people to actually understand these kind of access negotiations and things was one thought. But the other thought was also around the need for kind of solidarity around red lines and the extent to which our competitive funding environment and our competitive contracting model challenges and can undermine that, I think, is really hard, because it reduces the space by which the humanitarian sector can together push back, or but also I know that agreeing red lines even within organizations is extremely hard. I remember in my last job we were trying to agree in a federated structure on red lines around counterterrorism requirements coming from donors. Oh my God, it was impossible. We thought it would be really, we thought we'd start up here, and as it was like, and actually being able to agree in a federated structure on, one or two red lines is very hard to do when you look into the complexities of the contracting that we were already doing. It's really hard. But yeah, there's something around, that's the solidarity on red lines, which is fundamental to protecting that space, but hard to achieve.
And Miro, William, what do you think about is the solidarity within the sector in the face of such, dilemmas?
I can give a personal couple of examples. So I was working in Zimbabwe in the early 2000s. Robert Mugabe was the president. He and ZANU-PF and the military did what was known as Operation Murambatsvina, where they cleared out a lot of people from the urban areas, killed quite a few, and just bulldozed down their dwellings and forced them to leave elsewhere. And I was in a heads of agency meeting, and I said, we need to make a stance. We need to say, government, this is not right. And I was the only one. Everyone else said, don't be stupid, don't be naive. What are you talking about? You might threaten our registration. We won't be able to stay and work in Zimbabwe. Don't you dare speak out. But the agency I worked for was happy for us as one agency to speak out, and I was really glad I did. And some might say, well, how about neutrality? But actually, it didn't matter so much if the agency I was working with was kicked out. I think that was a red line, that if we didn't advocate for those who were being violently oppressed, I'd say we were failing in our job as that agency. So we did. There was no great outcome from that, I'm afraid to say. Zimbabwe is still in a very difficult crisis situation. Same in Ethiopia, when, for example, Norwegian Refugee Council was banned from operating for 6 months. Again, it overstepped the line when it came to the government. NRC was quashed down. Again, I was in a heads of agency meeting in Addis Ababa. Same story. So in terms of solidarity, sometimes it happens, and there's been great solidarity around what's the awful atrocities happening in Gaza, etc. right now. But when it comes sometimes to individual agencies deciding whether their registration is more important than speaking out, solidarity is definitely not happening everywhere.
It's really difficult to follow up after William's intervention, but maybe back to the Afghanistan example. That was part of the whole debate, and there were my impression was a number of organizations were really quite happy to basically, wash their hands and leave. And again, understand completely the rationale behind such thoughts and intentions. But that whole conversation did continue for quite some time. I don't recall all the details, but it was very intense, and there was a lot of different opinions and debates. But I think eventually most have agreed on a sort of, let's say, red lines that we would have in order to, and agreed in terms of, like, let's say, took a solidarity approach, understanding that humanitarian needs somehow are higher than taking a principled position of leaving the country because of human rights abuses. And therefore, we kind of achieved some kind of broad solidarity and consensus that we should continue. But I don't think it was very simple and straightforward and easy. And then maybe on Gaza, yeah, I feel there's a lot of solidarity there. I mean, for example, my organization, our policy has always been, you do advocacy only if you're operational in that country, because that gives you legitimacy, which I think is the right approach. And we haven't been working in Palestine and occupied Palestinian territories, but the scale of what is going on there simply forced us to rethink that approach and at least to limit our advocacy on calling out IHL abuses. Also, well, first and foremost in solidarity with people who are suffering, but then also with organizations who are struggling to provide humanitarian assistance there.
Thank you. Shifting gears a bit again towards the standards and quality, and something I'm dying to ask William, something you mentioned in Geneva, I remember earlier this year. I think it was you who said that with the global funding for humanitarian assistance in decline, then maybe is there a silver lining when it comes to the quality of assistance that we would be expecting, that we are actually then for, creating this competition more, would then expect also better response?
Yeah, I think there are two responses to that. Let me just talk briefly on why we insist on a certain minimum level of quality. It's not the level of quality in and of itself, it's because we respect the inherent dignity of each person. So by saying that there are minimum standards, we're saying even if you can't reach those standards, for example in Gaza right now, don't give up on them. Have those standards there and advocate and call and demand and say this is unacceptable day after day after day until you reach that minimum standard. Because if you're going below that standard, we're not respecting the dignity of each individual. And that's at the heart of the UN Charter, it's at the heart of the Declaration of Human Rights, it's at the heart of the Humanitarian Charter, and it's about the heart of being a humanitarian. If we're giving up on dignity, we're actually saying we're not humanitarian anymore. The other flip side of that coin about the silver lining, about efficiency, yes, I would say that there is. To an extent, as Juliet says, there had been a lot more funding coming in the last 30 years to the humanitarian sector. And to an extent, agencies then make decisions on hiring staff, on opening up new offices, etc., which perhaps goes a little bit beyond economy, efficiency, and effectiveness, because they're going a little bit, what's the right word, flabby, a little bit less lean, perhaps. And yes, the silver lining is that, okay, agencies, when we're under the cosh now and having to make really hard decisions, then yes, that does produce, I think, a silver lining of saying we are going to be really lean, we are going to be as effective and efficient as possible, and spending that money as much as we can on who the ultimate person we want to support is that person in need.
Okay. I agree with what William said, and there is a kind of a silver lining in terms of that needs to force the sector to a little bit slimmed down on some of the structures that we have. It has grown enormously over the years. But I think at the same time, what worries me is that, and Juliet, you spoke about it, yes, humanitarian funding has grown enormously, but so have the humanitarian needs. And now we're seeing this decline in funding, and I don't think the needs are declining, they actually continue to grow. At the same time, I think also many organizations have decided not to just do pure humanitarian response, but to do sort of, I don't know, there were different terminologies, humanitarian plus, you know, doing some kind of small-scale development, which again, it's fine. But right now there's somehow that kind of debate that we need to go back to basics and address pure humanitarian needs. At the same time, I'm not convinced that the large-scale development in, for example, protracted crises in places where you could perhaps invest in development because they're not active conflict zones, I'm not sure that they are there. So although donors want to say that we need to decrease the needs, I'm not sure how we're going to achieve that if the humanitarian funding is going down and at the same time there's no development investment and there are no conflict resolution to all these numerous wars. So I'd be very cautious about the silver lining here. I mean, it may force us to be a little bit more efficient, but I'm not sure that collectively we can really address all these growing problems.
Yeah, I feel a bit negative about the prospect too. I think what's happened is within the humanitarian sector over the years, we've built an infrastructure that we now can't afford to maintain, given the shift in the funding environment. But what's happening is that, and so often on these things, like these kind of conversations, you end up on the point of leadership, and leadership within the humanitarian sector just isn't that well understood. Like, there's some interesting bits about it, but like what we mean by leadership, how it works, when it's done well, and collective leadership also. But we've built this big infrastructure based on the last 30 years of financing. Now our financial situation is changing. And it could be a really good time to rethink it, but we know that leaders are incentivized, and also they're good leaders because they're about the survival and development of their organizations. The growth incentive is very strong in our humanitarian sector. Being bigger is it becomes a default success metric for leaders, and it's really difficult for leaders to actually honestly move beyond that. I've seen 2 cases that have come out. But so what that means is that organizations will be, and they are, jostling and positioning for why they're the best positioned. The intermediary question for INGOs is really, really, really important. And they're all playing their, we do good capacity building card, and we do, all this justifying why intermediaries should be doing this and why they're good at it without saying, actually, there's a really good study that's come out, can't remember the name of the organization, but, looking at, actually, why don't you cut out all the middle people? Yeah, the future is pooled. Donors cannot handle more contracting relationships. We know that. Intermediaries take a whack of slice. Oh, sorry, this isn't very evidence-based. But they, intermediaries take a big old slice of the pie. And the added value actually is the evidence base for the added value. Is patchy. How about cutting out the middle people and going for pooled funds? Because the various types of pooled funds are overperforming, the good ones, are overperforming on a lot of the metrics, particularly around localization, but also other kind of learning initiatives and stuff. So it's really interesting. But I think that, it's unlikely. I think that the existing power holders and the incentives for leaders is to protect the organization. And that will get in the way of the potential efficiency and effectiveness discussions that a change in our funding situation could lead to. And I think it's very difficult, and it's a little bit why I was kind of going back to the example of the 90s, it's very difficult for leaders to step outside of the individual interests and mandates of their organizations to create the collective leadership that's required for those sorts of changes. It's very difficult for that to happen, and we don't quite know what the magic ingredients are that are needed to make that happen.
And indeed, what you mentioned also earlier, the kind of tension between this professionalization and localization itself, and then going back to what William and Sve kind of represent is this highly technical field of expertise, you know, with how many standards again?
About 53, yeah.
53 in Sve alone, and then you have the compendiums and additional ones on top. So highly technical, and then at the same time the localization, which would mean that, you know, this technical expertise is dispersed across a very wide range. So it is a question of, you know, how do we get to this middle ground there, that we have, for example, pool funds as an example of that, who are able to not just be the intermediaries in financing, but also then add the capacity building element on top of that. But being conscious of time, we should now allow the audience to ask away all of your questions as well. And we have a couple of hands up already, so let's take 2 and then for the first round. Sorry. Karin.
Hi, my name is Karen from Data Friendly Space. I loved that whole conversation, but particularly the last 5 minutes. And when I started in the sector, something that made me want to go into university and study humanitarianism was this idea that us as humanitarians are working to put ourselves out of work. Us as humanitarian organizations are working every day to put ourselves out of business. And I think we have to ask if that question is actually true when we talk about the ethics of the humanitarian sector. So my question is, how do we normalize humanitarian organizations going out of business because they have reached their goal and paving the way for new organizations? And how do we kind of stop trying to keep ourselves alive? And how do we, you know, how do we normalize going out of business?
Thank you. There was another hand there and a couple there.
Hello, my name is Tatiana. I'm from Ukraine, and I'm also from Office of Democratic Institution and Human Rights. And at the same time, I'm a volunteer of some of the Ukrainian organizations. And I have one question about more about ethics dilemmas. Could you tell your thoughts and ethical issues and dilemmas of aid in occupied territory, especially with the cases of Kherson region when it was on the occupation, and some of the international organizations are not allowed to this territory because of occupation, and only some volunteers can provide this help. And my question about what do you think, is it ethical, or what is your thinks about ethical issues and dilemmas? Is it ethical for your point of view to take the aid, especially knowing that these aids come from the occupiers who get this from their local peoples? So this help, this aid, not from there, but from the territory which was occupied. And this aid provide the help, but at the same time, it's only stolen. So what do you think you're thinking about ethical dilemmas of the organizations and at the same time of the people who live in this territory? Is it ethical to take this aid or not? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one more from this side of the...
Hello, I'm Kanchi. I work at the Estonian Refugee Council. We've been talking about the more, say, macro-level ethical dilemmas, and I'm wondering, kind of curious to hear about the everyday ethics of working in the humanitarian sector. William said something very interesting. He said, people are coming to the field looking at it more as a career rather than a calling. And, you know, as a, let's say, much newer humanitarian than you all, I'm wondering, do you think, is that a bad thing? Should we let competent staff go because their heart is not in the right place? And then building on that, how do you make it so it becomes a calling? How do you make the field less depressing, more motivating? Maybe too big of a question to ask, but yeah.
Thank you. Who wants to start? Juliet?
Can I just, because I think the first question and the third one are quite related, and I've become a little bit fascinated. Also, just, I know it feels very doom and gloom, just as a reminder, the State of the Humanitarian System report demonstrates that the humanitarian sector is delivering more and better aid than ever before, and we are learning and improving, but as Christina mentioned, it's incremental. So just as a reassurance, there is lots and lots of good stuff going on, and we are learning and improving, particularly in the sector and technical areas. So we're getting better at cash interventions, better at nutrition interventions, better at health interventions, all those sorts of areas. But we keep getting stuck on these sticking points around localization, accountability to affected populations, and linking relief and development, where we're feeling this kind of, and now actually the IHL thing this last 2 years, of course, has become very prominent. But you know, it's these sticking points where we feel very frustrated because we're not able to make the changes that we want of ourselves, which I think links a little bit to the how do we normalize going out of business? So, because I've been looking back over this last 20 years, looking at the tsunami response, which is basically kind of my generation of humanitarianism, and what I've realized is that, you know, humanitarian trends are generational, and that's really, really important. One of the things that I realized thinking back to was that the generation that I came into, my bosses were the ones that had worked on the Ethiopia famines, and they had worked on the Rwanda crisis, and they had been the ones trying to make the decisions. And as a result of their personal experiences and their connections and relationships that they'd built during that time, they brought in a momentum of activism and change into the sector that was then very formative throughout those kind of early 2000s. So, you know, initiatives like ours, but also, you know, that very strong narrative of putting ourselves out of business and all those sorts of things. What I find a little bit fascinating now is like that drive to professionalize the sector has also meant that we used to look to the INGOs to bring the activism and change and pressure on the kind of UN-y bits that were more resistant or resilient to change. Now it feels a bit like the INGOs are kind of like in that resistant to change bunch, or like Christina ages ago used the word permafrost, and it's always what's in my head, that kind of, that bit that is kind of very slow to change over time. And we're looking elsewhere for that activism, that drive, that push that you need for systems change. And it's a little bit like, you know, where is it? I wonder if it's coming from the national organisations whose voice and representation and good examples of how things can be done differently are gaining weight, definitely, but, you know, haven't quite reached that tipping point of pushing change within the permafrost. And I think that's what's interesting, is that it's not a bad thing that our sector has professionalized. It's not a bad thing that and in fact, you know, we were talking last night about actually with this, the younger, are we doing enough to make sure that the humanitarians that are coming through the system now are aware enough of SPHERE, are aware enough of all the learning that predates our current interventions, which was telling us the same thing, and it's really, really important, and are aware enough of the importance of the principles and how to translate and protect them and the integrity of them in your work. And actually, we're not sure that we're doing enough to bring that generation through with that. So we want more professionalization in that. What we want to do is we need to find parts of the sector that aren't so tied with the kind of straitjacket we've put ourselves in, that they're able to agitate and push and promote change itself, because the traditional sector is a little bit stuck in the structures that we've put for ourselves, and what we're missing is that kind of agitation and change and movement. But I think it'll be coming from the national organisations, things like the start hubs, those initiatives that are bringing together collective voices at national and regional levels are quite rightly putting more pressure on the mainstream sector, and that needs to increase and continue. So in terms of shifting those incentives, we need the system to deliver at scale and at speed. So we need that big part of the system, because that's what we were built to do as a sector. But we also need donors and others and collective initiatives like ours and individual leaders to promote, understand, and create more space for the voices that will be able to prompt a shift in the permafrost. Sorry, long answer.
Thank you. Miro, do you want to take maybe the occupied territories?
I will try. I will make a statement straight at the beginning that I'm not 100% up to my knowledge on our, in detail of our operations in Ukraine. But what I can tell you is that we are working pretty much near the front line, just as where the front line is with the east of Ukraine. But our big frustration has always been with the Ukrainian response, again, because of, like, for example, I'll give you another example before I fully answer your question. In Yemen, we work both in north and south, and we try to have more or less, in terms of the scale of the assistance, almost equal approach to both, so that we are really addressing both sides of the conflict, and we provide humanitarian assistance in both of these parts of the country. In Ukraine, we were not able to do that. In the Russian-occupied territories, we have no access. And this, for us, is really a challenge. And we've been discussing even ourselves if there's some kind of form of partnerships we could have so that we could change that. But I think it is very difficult. So this is where our, somehow, neutrality is failing us. We're just not able to do that. If I understood your second part of the question, which was, is it ethical to take aid from the occupiers? If I understood, you said that aid was taken from someone who needs aid to be given to, hypothetically, to you to give it to someone else. I mean, my straight answer to that would be, you have to have the analysis, you have to have deep knowledge, what is the situation, you need to understand where the aid is coming from, and I would say, without knowing more, that it would be wrong. But I hope you appreciate that I don't know enough details to be able to elaborate a little bit further. But just as a principle, I would say, yeah, that's wrong. You can't take aid from someone who really needs it to just give it to someone else, especially if there's a political kind of agenda behind it.
And at the same time, this is, I think, a place where different, let's say, innovative alternative methods of delivery are and can be used in order to reach, for example, cash assistance can travel across and into the occupied areas, even if there's no physical access and there's no possibility of gaining physical access. But William, also,
thanks.
The question.
Yeah, I'll try and answer both questions with one example. But before that, just a reminder that neutrality, it's not an individual, it's not a personal stance, it's an organizational. So while the organization might make this stance for a means to an end, it's not as an organization or humanitarian sector is asking you as an individual to be neutral. So just be clear on that. After the invasion of Ukraine, the large-scale one, I was in Chisinau in Moldova for about 3 months. Quite quickly, we saw as humanitarians that many refugees were either heading further west or going back because it was deemed safe enough to go back to where they were coming from. But many agencies decided to stay. And a lot of that decision was based on the pressure of the head office saying, we have raised a significant amount of money. We maybe have got someone in Poland, we may have got someone in Romania, we're trying to get in Ukraine. You stay in Moldova and you spend. So that, in terms of, are we making a decision, perhaps not as an organization, but as an operational area? That, I think, is a really important question that we're not asking ourselves enough in many contexts. And particularly then, staying in Moldova simply to spend money was a really, really a bad example, and going back to the early days when we said we're failing as a sector. But how it links again to, so I quite quickly moved down to Odessa, and the organization I was working with at the time headed further east. And they were very clear, we have no intention of working cross-border or working in Russia. So it's fine, just stay in Ukraine. We can keep working here, and we don't have to say that we're being neutral. But for other agencies, particularly, for example, ICRC, if they didn't be very clear about neutrality, they wouldn't be able to. And they have a very clear mandate, mission, huge agency. They're able to do it, and thank goodness they can. But they have to say we're neutral. They have to be able to work with both sides. And that's really important as a sector, that we have both. We have both those agencies who are saying we are neutral and we can work with both sides, and those who say, look, we're just going to stay in Ukraine, we've got no intention of going to Russia. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but let me hand it back to you.
Thank you. And since we started 5 minutes after time, then we'll take maximum 2 more questions. I saw, Thomas, you asked a couple online. So if you want to ask them yourself, then that's... and then maybe one more from the audience who... Yeah.
Hi. Yes, I think some of those questions I asked have actually already been answered, but there is one question that comes to mind, and it's, so we talk about exit, but we also, and we talk about protracted crises. But I remember working in the Philippines in Typhoon Haidai, and after we did emergency response, people who've been hit by the typhoon, but then we went to the other locations and we discovered that all of the people in areas that weren't affected also met all of our standards for critical coping strategies. In Ukraine, people on the front line, conflict affected, but there is also millions of people who would meet our standards for assistance pre-war. So how do you, and I've most recently been working on Northwest and Northeast Syria, supporting there, and the teams keep asking me, doing multi-purpose cash, we need to exit, we can't afford to keep giving these people assistance, but there's no employment, there's no jobs, this is chronic poverty. They're chronically vulnerable, they're going catastrophic coping mechanisms because of poverty, but how do we exit? So that's the same question in Kampala, it's the same question around. How do we ethically divide between emergency aid, which has a time-bound shock, versus trying to keep people alive? And if we're working with people and they are doing catastrophic mechanisms, when do we stop? Because otherwise, that's, I feel, is where a lot of the issue is. And I don't have the answer, so I was wondering if you guys have thoughts. Over.
Thank you. I'm Konstantin. I'm working with NORCAP. I have a question more of a hypothetical nature. Imagine that all these years haven't happened, and you're back at the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino. What kind of ethical principles would you, now knowing, would you have designed for the humanitarian sector? Would you still rely on the same ones, or would you think of something else?
Well, that's a full panel there, I feel. But let's keep it to short answers. Let's start with any of you.
I'll take that question quickly. Honestly, my answer would be I would not. I mean, I don't want to. I mean, I really need to think about this. But my instant reaction to your question would be, and I spent 16 years with the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, so humanitarian principles are somehow kind of tattooed on my forehead. And I really believe that this is the only sensible framework that kind of captures what we are supposed to be doing in order to, in line with humanity and impartiality, really provide assistance to all those that need it. So I would not, if I would be in a position to have to rethink the humanitarian principles, I'm not sure I would be able to come up with better ones. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that would be my initial thought on that.
Thank you, Miro. And again, quick, short answers this round. So exit and...
Yeah, I did want to, and I was wondering how I was going to bring it in. Did want to just read out just the introduction from the UN Charter. So the UN Charter says, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow." So we kind of need to go back to that UN Charter. I think the rest of the UN Charter we need to keep but update. We need to decolonize it, for example. We need to make sure there's locally led in there. But we have 120 conflicts going on now. And here they're talking about 2 conflicts. I think if we get rid of what are known as the 4 fundamental principles, but we need to, as I said earlier, we need to be really clear on what they are. I think it's not throwing them away. I think it's have a common understanding of what they are. So the frontline worker, the capital-based worker, and the head office worker are all on the same page, which is not what we have at the moment, which is why there's confusion. There's confusion about the terms. Often people get impartiality and neutrality mixed up, which isn't great. But let's just make sure that every single humanitarian worker knows what is the difference and then how to implement that. So I would agree with Miro that let's not get rid of them now, I think, because they're foundational. But we need to change what we have built on those foundations. Yeah, let me stop there.
And that's already kind of a great closing remark there, but Juliet, on this
maybe I'll take the other one about how to exit ethically. So I think it's really hard, it's for definite, because you're talking about very complex vulnerabilities and all that sort of stuff. But I think there are lots of good examples and good suggestions and good findings from evaluations around how we could certainly be doing it better. And those aren't being picked up and acted on for quite a lot of tricky reasons. But I think, things like localization, someone used the phrase, localization is the nexus glue. And I love that phrase. It's like, actually, yeah, a more localized, system will be better able to respond to integrated forms of risk, vulnerability, and need in more flexible ways that are, that are more appropriate, and that should lead to better exit strategy. Flexible funding that enables us to respond to that should also be. So those things are already well known. I think there's also that one around. We did a synthesis analysis on the Nexus findings from Nexus evaluations, and the lack of progress is stark. And the whole point about it is, well, 2 great findings. One is that no one knows what the Nexus is, which people find quite reassuring. The other is that actually the sector isn't sure what the Nexus is trying to achieve, and therefore whether or not it's being successful. So if it's to the one area where it is doing good stuff is improving coordination. So there is now an understanding or emerging platforms for coordination between development and humanitarian actors, but very early stages still. But the whole idea about collective outcomes, we're still a million miles away from that. So there's kind of building block elements that we do know about that we should be working further on that will make a difference, I think.
Thank you. And I think we have really opened up a lot of boxes there, on neutrality, on funding, on independence, on quality, on the future of principles as well as IHL. And I'm not sure whether we answered many questions there or left you with some food for thought, because none of these issues that we discussed today are in any way black and white. There's no, and I think this is one of the key takeaways, that these are not simple situations, but we need to be able to navigate them nonetheless. We need to make the operational decisions on the ground every day, and then also justify the decisions we make. And hopefully these are made on based on solid information and understanding of the operational context. And if we fail, then we should be sharing and learning. I think this message came through as well. Taken that we have many questions still, but not any more time to go through them. So I encourage everybody who had some additional questions, approach the panelists over the course of the lunch, because now is the time to thank you all for joining this difficult, full of dilemmas and conundrums discussion, and opening these topics for us. So let's take what it is to take from here and discuss them onward over the lunch. But thank you, all the panelists. Thank you.